Good morning and welcome. I'm Chris Stewart. I'll be your MC this morning. I just ask you to silence your phones. We're going to move through this agenda pretty quickly this morning. We've got 3, potentially 4 speakers this morning. We may have a Broadcasting Board of Governors board member with us at some point this morning who will provide some comments. One other comment, you don't have to rush through and take notes. We will post, BBG will post the video as well as the PowerPoint on their website within the next couple days. So don't worry about rushing and taking notes. You'll be able to gain access to that in the next couple days. We're pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Today we're going to look at findings from Nigeria, very topical issue. It's in the news everywhere around the world today. I do want to highlight our next event, which is on June 3rd. It's going to focus on Ukraine. We actually just came out of the field in Ukraine, so this is fresh data. Very topical as well, so we'll be holding that event on June 3rd. We were able to get into Crimea and do oversampling in Crimea, so you'll be able to look at variation between Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and Crimea. So that'll be a real good event. Our first speaker this morning is Mr. Bruce Sherman, Director of the Office of Strategy and Development of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Sherman.
Thank you, Chris. My role is just to say hi on behalf of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Those who frequently come to our BBG-Gallup research briefings have heard me say before why we do these, but I repeat it every time because we have people new to the briefings. We do these to make available to the public insights from our research around the world that we think are of broad interest. We're covering here the media environment in Nigeria, and as we do in all these briefings, we look at the media environments in the countries that we've researched. We don't get into our own performance, but we do, of course, look at our research, do our research in order to track our own performance in the field. Voice of America in Nigeria does quite well, but we aren't focused on that. Rather, we're focused on what we think will be of broad interest to the public, and that is what are the emerging trends in Nigeria with respect to how Nigerians are using media. What we've also begun to do over the last 3 or 4 research briefings is to incorporate findings from the Gallup World Poll. And that is so that we provide you with an even broader assessment of the operating environment for our broadcasts in a given country. Naturally, we, as we track media use, are also very interested in what people are thinking in the countries that we're targeting. And so we find it beneficial to include information from the Gallup World Poll. In fact, we're very pleased, and I'll reciprocate Chris's kind words, to be partnered with Gallup at the BBG in order to carry out our media research and then have access to the findings from across the world that Gallup gets through its World Poll activity in 140, 150 countries. So again, welcome. We appreciate your being here and look forward to your questions after the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Our next speaker is Ms. Sonia Glockel, who's a research analyst with the International Broadcasting Board of Governors, or International Broadcasting Bureau. Sonia is going to set the stage for the media environment in Nigeria and talk a little bit about some of the trends. So please join me in welcoming Sonia. You switch things up? Okay. My apologies. Looks like we're going to switch things up. We're going to begin with my colleague Dan Foy, a research consultant here at Gallup, who's going to set the stage with public opinion data and talk a little bit about the World Poll and some of the trends in public opinion in Nigeria. So please join me in welcoming Dan Foy.
We actually had a coin flip that we didn't tell Chris about, and I lost, so I'm up first. So I'm going to start off, as Chris mentioned, by talking about some recent findings from the Gallup World Poll. Bruce already gave a brief introduction to the World Poll. It's a global self-funded research effort that Gallup started in 2005. In the case of Nigeria, we've conducted 9 waves of interviewing, most recently in July of 2013. And our 10th wave of interviewing is going to enter the field today, I believe. We are just wrapping up training. And so we'll have some updated insights, I'm sure, coming up on the Gallup website in the very near future. Just a brief note on the methodology. Each wave of interviewing consists of 1,000 surveys. It's a nationally representative sample of the adult population in the country. Face-to-face, we go door-to-door throughout the country to conduct these interviews. And interviewing is done in the 5 primary languages: English, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and Pidgin. One of the challenges when looking at Nigeria is making sense of the vast diversity of the country. This is the largest population in Africa of 170 million people, roughly, and that represents over 250 ethnic and tribal groups speaking upwards of 500 languages. So one of the challenges then is to figure out a way to simplify some of this diversity and look for some of the really important findings and patterns. One way to do this is to look at the north-south divide in the country. Up until 1960, when the country received its independence, it was actually administered in separate divisions, and as a result, there's a lot of cultural and historic divisions between the north and south. The primary one that you see here is the linguistic and religious division. In the case of the north, Hausa is the primary language spoken, and the population is predominantly Muslim, whereas in the south, much higher rates of Christian population, and English, Yoruba, Igbo, the other languages tend to be spoken more commonly. And as you'll see on the subsequent slides, this is really a major determinant of some of the life outcomes of the populations living on either side of this north-south line. So diving into the current conditions, one of the first things that we ask on every World Poll survey is to have the respondents imagine what we call our ladder items. This is known as the Cantrell self-anchoring scale, and has the respondent think of a ladder with steps numbered from 0 to 10, and imagine that the ladder represents the possible outcomes for their life, with 0 representing the worst possible life, 10 representing the best possible life. And we then ask them to rank themselves on this ladder both today and where they think they'll stand in 5 years. We take the data from these 2 questions and turn it into what we call the Life Evaluation Index. And this classifies respondents according to whether they're thriving, struggling, or suffering. Those that are thriving are those who feel that they stand at a 7 today and feel that they'll be at an 8 or above in the future. Those who are suffering are at a 4 or below today, and don't see any prospects for life improvement, think they'll remain at a 4 or below in the future. The struggling group are those in between. As you can see, Northerners are more likely to be suffering, far less likely to be thriving than their Southern counterparts. By extension, this same pattern holds for Christians and Muslims. In fact, in the case of suffering, an even higher percentage, 10% of the Muslim population in Nigeria is currently classified as suffering. Now, the reason this metric is so important is because it's linked to so many key outcome variables: development indicators, predictions of health, other measures of economic well-being, emotional well-being. They are all tied to this basic measure. So, as I said, economics, one of the primary factors that's linked to these well-being outcomes. If we look at the overall picture, you can see that Nigerians tend to be struggling pretty heavily on the economic front. 2/3 of the population is living on less than $2 per day. Just 1 in 5 think that their national economy is getting better, and only 44% believe that their personal financial status is improving, their standard of living is improving. Again, in each case, you can see that those in the north fare worse on these measures than do their southern counterparts. Another major driver of these life evaluation outcomes is the safety and security element. This is a really dramatic shift that we've seen in recent years. At the moment, just 37% of Northerners say that they feel safe walking alone at night in the city or area where they live. That's a drop from 70% just 2 surveys prior to this. In the case of the South, there's been a slight decline, though nowhere to the same extent as what's happened in the North. Now, what's driving this decline is really more or less what's in the headlines a lot for Nigeria recently, but Boko Haram in the case of the North. This trend line for the north is more or less the history of that group within the country. You can see back in 2009, perceptions of safety in the north started to slip to some extent. This is when the group first started its initial terror campaign. Brutal government crackdown at the time forced the group underground for a time period, but 2011, they resumed their activities, and you can see that the perceptions of safety have fallen off since then. Really the most dramatic decline coming from 2012 to 2013, when the percentage who felt safe dropped from roughly 6 in 10 to the 37% we see today. This corresponds to the time when the government declared a state of emergency for the northeastern states, that have been most affected by the crisis, meaning that not only were civilians in those areas being affected by the Boko Haram attacks, but also a lot of folks being caught in the crossfire between the military and the insurgents in that area. One important point, if you look at the trend line for the south here, you'll notice that in 2008, there's a substantial dip in perceptions of safety in the south, and for a time period, Southerners were actually less likely to feel secure than their northern brethren. This is an important reminder that Boko Haram is not the only security challenge that Nigeria faces. In the case of the South, this corresponds to the height of the activities of the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta Group, which is an insurgent campaign focused in the south of the country. There's a ceasefire that corresponds very well to the shift in increasing northern perceptions of safety in the south that we see here. But there's, again, a long history of internal insecurity, coups. There's been a civil war, and Nigeria has dealt with a lot of these challenges, and even if the Boko Haram problem is addressed, it's unlikely to bring safety to the full population anytime soon. One of the big shocking statistics that's come out of the current crisis with Boko Haram is the scale of human displacement. There's been recent reports that upwards of 300,000 have been forced to relocate from those northeastern states that are in the state of emergency at the present, and as many as 500,000 may be displaced within the country at the present time. You can see again in the World Poll data just a really dramatic jump in 2013 in the percentage of those living in the north who say that they've not necessarily been forced, but that they have moved from their city or area, from another city or area in a different part of the country within the last 5 years. I've seen that rate triple from 2012 to 2013, whereas in the South, it's remained essentially unchanged. So shifting gears now to some of the larger trends and the background factors that explain these current conditions today. First off, returning to those same items that we talked about on the economy, you can see that the prospects for Nigerians have been growing somewhat worse over time on the economic front. This is despite the country recently gaining the title of the largest economy in Africa after a long overdue rebasing of their GDP calculation. But looking at the background here, which is the percentage living on $2 per day, the first time Gallup calculated this measure in 2007, it was right around 44% of the population. Again, as I said earlier, we're up to 2/3 of the population now. And this is in part due to the global financial crisis, which really racked Nigeria in 2009. You can see at that point the percentage living on $2 per day jumped to over 8 in 10 in the population. But even since then, after the initial recovery, that rate has increased 10 percentage points since 2010. At the same time that the percentage living on less than $2 per day continues to tick up, we see on perceptions of their standard of living and perceptions of the momentum of the national economy that both of these items have been trending down since 2012. In 2012, we had over half thought that their standard of living was getting better, and fully a third thought that the national economy was improving. Both rates have fallen off to 44% for the standard of living and just 1 in 5 for the national economy today. So what explains these economic troubles that the population deals with? In a word, corruption. This is one of the items that we don't see variation on over time. And at the moment, 90% of Nigerians think that corruption is widespread in their government. 80% feel that corruption is widespread in businesses within their country. Now this corruption takes a number of forms, ranging from the everyday bribes in the front lines with police and local bureaucrats, right up to, if you follow the headlines at all, allegations of massive thefts of oil wealth in the billions of dollars. A consequence of this corruption is low confidence in government institutions. So the military is the most trusted institution in the country at present. 2/3 say that they have confidence in the military. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum here, just 18% have confidence in the honesty of elections, and just 30% have confidence in the national government that those elections produced. One of the other striking differences on this chart is the gap between the military and the police in terms of confidence. The military, again, 2/3 confident at the present. In the case of the police, just 41% say that they're currently confident in the police forces. There's a couple of factors that go into explaining this. One is, as I mentioned, the police tend to be a very visible form of the type of corruption that Nigerians experience, day-to-day bribes for basic activities. Some of the other research that we've done in the past, we've heard reports of folks going to report a crime at a police station only to find themselves arrested because they're someone who had information and knew about the activity. The military, on the other hand, tends to be less visible and there are some favorable memories, surprisingly, of military rule, which ended in 1999. It's going to be interesting, though, to see how this number might shift in the upcoming data, given the challenges that the military has had in containing the Boko Haram insurgency. So one of the really troubling correlations to that low confidence and honesty of elections is the fact that there is a presidential election coming up in February of next year in Nigeria. Here we have the approval rating of the leadership of the country. And you can see that President Jonathan, who took office in 2010, although he enjoyed a brief honeymoon period where 64% said that they approved of his job performance, that since fell off fairly rapidly to just 39.9% today. You can see that this is a somewhat normal pattern, perhaps. I think we see this in a lot of political environments. The prior president also experienced a brief period of high confidence shortly after his election, fell off quickly. In the case of these upcoming elections, this really presents an interesting scenario because there's been some significant developments on the political front within the country and a new opposition coalition that has been formed, lots of defections from the current ruling party, and February really holds a strong potential to perhaps be the first time that parties switch hands, or that power switches hands between the major political parties since the country returned to civilian rule. So switching from the domestic to international sphere for a moment, there's also been a decline of late in Nigerians' approval of foreign countries. Obviously, this is important to a lot of folks in the room and important to the BBG in particular. At the moment, the U.S. is still seen as seen most favorably. Still 60%, a solid majority, say that they approve of the leadership of the U.S., but that's dropped off from 76% in the prior survey. In the case of the other countries, this decline seems to have begun somewhat earlier in 2011, but I think it's an open question still as to exactly what's driving this shift. One possibility could be the economic side of things. You can see several of the countries' approval ratings dipped substantially in 2009 at the time of the global crisis, but I think that's still open for debate and would certainly welcome any thoughts from some of the other experts in the room after the event as to what might be driving these changes in Nigerians' perceptions of outside powers. So I just have the last couple of slides here to set up Sonia on the media environment. First off, media freedom. Perceptions of media freedom have been declining of late as well, fallen off since 60% thought that the media in their country had a lot of freedom in 2012. Today, that's down to just 41%, really a substantial shift. This actually parallels trends overall that Freedom House has reported that there's declines in global press freedoms really across the board. Their most recent report had some of the lowest levels of press freedoms that they've monitored. In the case of Nigeria, the lack of media freedom is due to primarily violence and intimidation against journalists, both on the part of insurgents like Boko Haram as well as the government and security forces. And you can see this pattern really play out when we split out the country again by north and south, that this decline is primarily coming from the north where the security situation is really the most acute at the moment, falling from 65% who had confidence in or who believed that the media in their country had a lot of freedom in 2012, right down to 34% today among those living in the North. And I think this really, again, underscores the importance of work that international broadcasters are trying to do here, especially among some of those most vulnerable populations, the Hausa speakers and living in northern Nigeria. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get it right this time. Our next speaker is Ms. Sonia Glockel, a research analyst with the International Broadcasting Bureau. She'll be walking us through some of the media research findings from the most recent study on media use in Nigeria. Sonia?
All right. The BBG-Gallup National Survey of Nigeria covered 4,000 adults. Although, as you can tell, some of you who are familiar with our questionnaires, they are very lengthy, so some of the questions in the survey were only asked of half the sample. In the end, we covered about 98% of Nigerian adults. Borno State was excluded, and if you followed the recent kidnapping, that was a wise choice for the safety of the interviewers. Fieldwork has taken place from January to March, so you can tell the data is very recent, and I had the privilege to be there for part of the fieldwork and to observe some of the interviews in the south, at least. Data has been weighted. And for those who are not familiar with the BBG surveys measure how respondents use media in a country. Very generally, from how often they use certain platforms, down to very, very detailed how these platforms are used, which operators they use, how frequently, where they access them, what they use, what topics they use on which platform. When we look at platform ownership trends, you can see that the ownership of radio in households has actually fallen by 10 percentage points since the last BBG-Gallup survey that was conducted in April of 2012. TV has also experienced a little bit of a decline. On the other hand, premium TV, so those people who have either satellite, cable, or Star Times at home, has increased by 5 percentage points. The ownership of PCs has remained stable, and which will make it surprising to you when you see the next point, internet access at home going up from just 8% in 2012 to 23% currently. Now, it's important to realize in this context that most of this internet access is actually coming from a mobile phone. It's not a fixed line. Speaking of mobile phones, we've also seen some very nice growth here. In fact, now the ownership, those people who say they have a mobile phone in their household is now higher than those who say they have a radio or a TV in their household. And personal mobile phone ownership is now at 83%, up 10 percentage points in just the past 2 years. Looking at who has actually gained a mobile phone in the past 2 years, you can see the growth has been pretty similar through different demographic groups, but the strongest growth by far has been in those over 55 demographic, aged 55 and older. And on the right-hand side, you can see the growth amongst Hausa speakers, and even their mobile phone ownership has gone up from 69% in 2012 to a current level of 77%. Hausa speakers, we tend to define them as those who speak Hausa at home or would understand all or most of a broadcast in Hausa. And when you look specifically, so far we've talked about ownership of platforms, but when you look specifically about how people use different platforms to get news, you will see that the use of the traditional big three media for news, which is radio, television, and word of mouth, has actually declined in the past 2 years, and quite substantially for word of mouth, going down from 84% to 66%. And if I make a quick plug here for the Ukraine event on June 3rd, you will actually see a similar decline there also for word of mouth in the crisis situation. While SMS and mobile apps use has been pretty steady for news, you will see that internet and social networking each increased by 5 percentage points in the past 2 years. Now, who are those people who have lately started using the internet? In 2012, we had 20% of Nigerians who used the internet on a weekly basis. Now we are already at 27% weekly use. But before we embrace the internet revolution in Nigeria, it is really important to think of those people who are left behind and left out of this revolution. You can see women, for example, have flatlined at just 18% weekly usage. The other group that is really left out are those over 35 whose internet use has actually gone down slightly. And one other group that has not really experienced any growth are Hausa speakers, where weekly internet use is now at 17%. Looking at media use amongst Hausa speakers over the past several years, some of you may have attended Bill Bell's presentation here 2 years ago, when we've really seen for the first time a very strong increase in television and internet use amongst Hausa speakers. For many years since we've done these surveys, radio has really been the primary platform to reach Hausas, no question. But then in 2012, we've really seen television and the internet joining into their media diet. Now you can see here that actually we have seen no more changes in radio use or internet use, and in fact television use has gone down a little bit. The decline in television news may be related to the fact that Hausas are also less likely to own a television set in their household, so communal TV viewing is still fairly common there. If you have a curfew in the north, where most of the Hausa reside, then it's more difficult to go elsewhere to watch TV. For the next couple of slides, we will be looking at how different demographic factors affect media use. You can see here for gender, men are more prolific users of just about any platform, and that's particularly evident for the internet, where weekly use amongst men is about double the level than amongst women. For age, you can also see some variations, although for radio and television are popular amongst pretty much any age group. Television slightly less so amongst the older, those over 55. But internet really, you can see a real staircase here in the middle, is very highly affected by age group. 42% amongst the 15 through 24-year-olds go online, just 5% of those aged 55 and above. And the two columns on the right-hand side, I should have actually explained this on the previous slide. Mobile phone use means any use of mobile phone in the past week, which could include phone calls, versus non-voice mobile phone use is an index that we built from all other mobile phone activities, such as SMS, social networking on a mobile phone, internet on a mobile phone, apps. And when you look at languages specifically, you see also still vast differences between the media use of different platforms between Hausa speakers and non-Hausa speakers. Hausa speakers are still the most avid radio listeners, but they do trail behind on other platforms, particularly, again, the internet. Looking at English skills are interesting for two ways. A, they are a proxy for education. B, English skills opens you up to the internet. When we ask people in what languages they use the internet, most people say they use the internet in English, although we also have a substantial number who say they use it in Hausa. But you can see very vast differences here, not for radio, which is the same between the two groups, but for TV and particularly the internet. 39% of those who speak English use the internet on a weekly basis, and just 6% of those who do not. Education is really, when we looked at all the different factors influencing media platform use, education is really of key importance here. And you can see there's some, apart from radio, which is fairly similar amongst all education groups, except for those who don't have any formal education who trail behind even in radio use, you can see that education, the use of any platform goes up very substantially with your increase of education. Most drastic, again, for internet, where just 1% of those who don't have any formal education use the internet on a weekly basis, compared to 62% amongst those who have higher education. It is often said that the teenagers are leading the mobile revolution, but when we looked very closely and broke down the ages a little bit further, you could tell that this is actually not the case, at least not for Nigeria. And that's potentially linked to just the spending powers of teenagers versus those who are already in their early 20s. It starts with mobile phone ownership. Only 3/4 of those 15 through 19-year-olds even own a mobile phone compared to 90% of those who are in their early 20s. And it goes through all the other activities as well, but particularly interesting I find for mobile internet use, for mobile social networking use, and for mobile app use. You can see the second column from the left, that is very high amongst those in their early 20s and not so high amongst those in their teens. Now that we've looked at different demographic factors, we can actually build some groups at the edge of society, the media-rich edge and the media-poor edge. So just, I've used the factors education, age, gender, urbanicity, and English skills to define the media-rich people. Those constitute 9% of Nigerian adults. And on the very other end of the spectrum, the media-poor people, those who use less platforms, use less outlets, use media less in general, are 6% of the Nigerian population. And for the next couple of slides, we will look at contrasts in the media diet of those who are media rich and those who are media poor. And you will see there's some really vast variations and very drastic gaps between these two groups when it comes to certain platforms. Radio is actually still the most egalitarian. 80% of those who are media rich use radio on a weekly basis, but still 58% of those who are media poor. Now, for all the other platforms other than mobile phone use in general, and that's in that case it's calling, the media rich really fall off, media poor really fall off very far behind the media rich. For TV use, almost 90% of media rich use TV on a weekly basis, just 27% of the media poor. Internet, even more drastic, 72% of the media rich use internet on a weekly basis, just 2% of those who are through the demographic factors classified as media poor. And for non-voice applications, it is also very big difference between 99% and 21%. So what does this really tell us? It tells us that if you want to talk to the media poor, radio is still your best bet. However, if you want to talk to the media rich, we could also call them the elites in a way, you have a choice of many different platforms. And interestingly, non-voice mobile phone is a very good way to get in touch with them as well. There's also not just a difference in use of different platforms between media rich and media poor, but there's also a difference in how closely they follow current events and how frequently they access news. When you look at the media rich, 2/3 of them follow news and current events about Nigeria at least somewhat or even a lot, but just 1/3 of those who are classified as media poor do so. And differences are also very striking when it comes to accessing news. 4 in 5 who are media rich use news at least once a day, compared to just 44% amongst those who are media poor. And last but not least, there's also a vast difference in the level of interest in a variety of topics that we ask respondents about. When we ask them, please tell me how interested you are in each of the following topics, those people who are listed here said they were at least somewhat interested in each of these topics. And you can tell health and healthcare is the only topic that we do not see any differences. Media poor people are just as interested in health as those who are media rich. And for the next couple of categories, education, human rights, religion, environmental issues, you don't see really vast differences either. But now that we get into the so-called hard news categories, that's when you really see vast differences. For economic news, political news, science, technology, and IT, the level of interest of those who are media poor is just at about half the level of interest of those who are media rich. And you also see a really big difference for sports at the very end, but that might be an issue with gender because remember we had included gender amongst the media poor, female amongst the media poor category. And that brings us to our closing thoughts. Nigeria is obviously, as we've heard from Dan, a very complex country with serious economic, political, and security challenges. In this context, it's good news that we can actually now use a wider variety of platforms to communicate to people, such as new media and internet and mobile phones. However, it is very important that we do not forget that certain segments of the population can still mainly be reached through traditional media, mostly the radio. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm pleased to have one of the Broadcasting Board of Governors board members with us this morning, Mr. Michael Meehan, and Michael's going to join us and make a few remarks from a board standpoint. Thanks, Mike.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the team for their work, not only on the research part, but also the journalists and the people who work in the Hausa service and at VOA in Africa. I had a chance 2-3 summers ago to go with Bruce and a couple other of my colleagues to Nigeria, and I had just gotten on the board, and we had a chance to go out into the field with our journalist, and you know, at that point in time, we were in a lot of security jams because of the nature of the Boko Haram at that time in Abuja, never mind where we are today with those poor girls. And so our thoughts go with them, and hopefully they're found well soon. But it just underscores the work that we do at the board to get information out and really be a reliable source of news. You can see by the data you just heard from the reliability of news inside of Nigeria is much lower than it was even 3 years ago when I was there on the ground with our team. So it's really important work that we do. We had a chance to meet with the vice president then, and it was you know, one of those moments where you sit in briefings like this in Washington and you don't really fully appreciate the impact you have sometimes when you're just grinding away and doing your job. But the vice president said he wakes up every day and he turns on his radio and he listens to Voice of America out of Washington, and you're like, really? Because it's like pretty cheap money, news and information, and like those are the people you're trying to reach, having this conversation, you know, about, well, you know, putting pressure on them to get them to do the right thing. So, you know, not that I didn't underappreciate the value of the work that everybody does on behalf of VOA and in our Africa service overall and VOA across the board, but it's those realities are reminders of why we, the policymakers, need to keep the pressure up even in a budget land of diminishing resources and stay nimble. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you all who work at this at the VOA and the BBG. And back to Bruce, back to Chris. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time for questions. A couple of my colleagues are roving around with microphones. If you just raise your hand and state your name and organization. Right down here, Morgan, right here.
Yes, my name is Mark Koenig from USAID. A question, I think, mainly for Sonia. I'm wondering, in your research, if you looked at what was happening within domestic as opposed to international broadcasting. Obviously, the domestic industry is changing. The share of private broadcasters, both in TV and radio, has been increasing. The number of outlets has become more competitive. So I'm wondering if you've also looked at the ratings of individual stations. How deep and detailed did you get with regard to different channels, both radio and TV?
Right. So there are hundreds, as you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of stations, and our interviews already last a good hour on average, so we cannot go through the individual reach of every station. We cover the big ones. But what I've actually found the more important question, or the more interesting for us, is we do ask people to rank to tell us unprompted about their top 3 sources of news and information. And for that, I can tell you the public broadcaster is still ahead of everyone else. Although there are some TV channels, especially that are private TV channels that are catching up here. And if I may say so, the international broadcasters are also playing a really big role there when it comes to being amongst the top sources for news and information, especially amongst the Hausa speakers.
Thank you, Sonia. Right down here, Steve.
Hi, Steve Crabtree with Gallup. Is this on? Yes. Just a quick question for Sonia. I was really struck by the gender differences in access to, especially new media, the internet, and how internet use among men has grown, maybe almost doubled in the past 2 years, while it's flatlined among women. And empowerment and treatment of women is obviously such a huge issue in Nigeria. I'm wondering if you looked at the difference between Northerners and Southerners to see if growth had actually grown in the South as opposed to the North.
Well, we do. I know Gallup likes to do the geographic division. We at the BBG really prefer to use the Hausa versus non-Hausa division, which is, as we've seen on Dan's first slide, is actually amongst very similar lines. And there you can tell, actually, internet has not grown. Internet use has not grown amongst Hausa speakers. So the growth in the North is much less than the growth of internet in the South.
So it's just that there has been, the internet growth is flatlined in the North period.
Amongst Hausa speakers, as I said, I didn't really look at the geographic
Okay.
so much.
Got it. Thank you.
Morgan, over here.
Hi, Jill Moss, also with USAID. I'm wondering, Sonia, if your research looked at all at social media platforms and prevalence of each of the platforms that are popular in Nigeria. Could you give us a little research detail on that?
We did look at the social media platforms, and I was actually really excited about Nigeria because in so many countries you can just see Facebook is dominant and then there's nothing else. But yes, in Nigeria there is other platforms. 2Go, for example, was doing really well there. But some of the other ones that I would have expected to play much of a bigger role are actually still about maybe like 10-20% of users use the other ones versus Facebook. Don't quote me on it, I think it was about 70% of internet users use Facebook. So Facebook is still by far the dominant, and you may have seen competing studies that were published recently, some of which seem to be sponsored by some of those competing social networks. So our study shows Facebook is ahead of others.
Hi, is this on? Great. Just one comment. I know that a couple of people have mentioned that the internet use among Hausa speakers has flatlined. That might be the case. I don't really know the details of those numbers, but just from a practical experience, the VOA Hausa digital platforms have exploded over the past 12 months. Maybe we're getting a bigger share of what's flatlined or whatever, but I just wanted to kind of give another perspective on what's happening from a programmatic level. I do have a question, though, and it has to do with methodology. You had mentioned, and this is directed to you, Sonia, that proficiency in Hausa, there's two levels of that. One is if you speak it at home, and the other is if you were to listen to a broadcast, if you would be able to understand all or most of it. Did any of your methodology include the ability to read Hausa?
No, we asked them if you listen to a broadcast in Hausa, how much would you understand?
So it's really a listening exercise.
Listening, I think the exact wording is listening or watching.
Right.
Yes.
Just bringing it back to mobile. Mobile is such a reading experience for a lot of people. Not entirely so, but a lot of people. So I'd be kind of curious to think about Hausa proficiency as it relates to reading a headline or reading a summary or 5 paragraphs possibly of an article at some point in the future.
It's a very good question, Stephen, and if you're interested, we can include the Read Hausa in the next one.
I will travel with you to Nigeria and ask them.
Just to acknowledge, Stephen Ferry is from the VOA Africa Division. He's joined at the table by the woman who's got the microphone now, Gwen Dillard, who heads the Africa Division at VOA. Next to Gwen at her right is Negusi Mengisha, who's the Deputy Director of the Division, and Leo Kian, to her left, is the head of the Hausa Service. So we welcome our VOA colleagues.
Thank you. This is the Africa row here. A question for Sonia, too. You mentioned that word of mouth seemed to be declining as a means for sharing information. which I think is a little bit unusual in African countries.
It declined its role for news specifically, but actually I'm really glad you bring this up because I did want to mention. So while word of mouth declined, what actually increased is online word of mouth, which is social networking, right? But it's just so at the same time, while traditional word of mouth may have gone down, which I personally also found surprising, but as I said, we've also found this in the Ukraine just now.
Okay, and I was,
but online word of mouth went up.
I was thinking about the Ukraine example too. Are you relating that face-to-face decline in word of mouth to being in conflict areas, or do you see other reasons for that?
I looked around, couldn't really find a good explanation, to be quite honest.
Yeah, my question might be first to Mr. Danfoy, maybe. From your research, do you think we can find out any indicator that actually tells us what pushes the use, what factors are pushing the use to Boko Haram? That's number one. It might help us to understand the situation. Number two, this might be for Sonia. Let's say if we just start a program for the youth and the women, in terms of priority, what kind of content do you think they would like to listen? If you see it, 1, 2, 3.
Sure. Speaking to the factors of radicalization that lead youth to Boko Haram, I think there's a couple of main suites of factors at play. One of those are some of the relative deprivation factors that we talked about. That you see that gap between North and South. There's also important gaps within those regions and within Hausa speakers between sort of the haves and the have-nots in a country where, again, it's the largest GDP in the continent, but you've got 2/3 of the population still on less than $2 per day. It means there's a very high concentration of wealth with a few people. The lack of development, grievances against the government certainly come into play there. There's certainly going to be some other specific factors at play as well. You can't discount the role of ideology in encouraging youth to join. But one of the things with Boko Haram in particular that I think has been effective for them, maybe not at the moment, but of late, is the fact that the government reaction to the militant group has been really quite indiscriminate. There's lots of reports of civilians being killed in crossfire, government engaging in summary executions on the spot when they arrest Boko Haram members, no due process whatsoever. In fact, the group's former leader came to this fate in 2009, and that was part of the initial crackdown. All sorts of actions like this really play into the narrative that Boko Haram is trying to promote, that they're legitimate and that the government that they're fighting is not, and that it's corrupt, and that youth should join the movement in order to improve their lives and the lives of their families, and in the case of Boko Haram, the lives of their members of their faith as well. But it's a complex problem for sure, but I think those are some of the basic elements at play.
And when it comes to different topics, Negusi, I can break them down for you this afternoon by women and youth. But in general, health really remains the one topic that everyone can get on board with, and which is quite frankly also reflected in VOA's performance, or with several of the health programs that VOA Hausa has performing very well.
Yeah, my question is actually to Sonia. I just want to know if your research considered the fact that as the regulations of Nigeria stop media houses from carrying our live broadcasts, whether you measure the impact of our broadcasting through affiliates. We've tried to grow more affiliate stations in the country, and we're now into the stage of co-content production. Did you measure this at all? Because we want to know the impact of how our programming is received by the local stations and redistributed in the country.
We do look at a certain breakdown on how exactly people listen to VOA programming, that is correct. And I'll be really happy to talk to you offline about this later when there's only people in the room who are interested in the VOA details.
Okay, secondly and finally, we have just introduced our radio stream program, Dendelim VOA, and we hope to be very strong on this, and it's on mobile. So definitely this is going to impact our programming from the ground in Nigeria, because we're targeting to grow about 10 to 20% of listeners on that platform. My question is, would you have put in place the evaluation mechanism to let us know the patronage of this mobile station by the end of the year? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I got the question, sorry. The question is, will we evaluate the mobile stream?
Yeah, how the mobile platform is doing with our new radio streaming in Nigeria.
We will have evaluation measures for this in place. But we won't be doing another full national survey before the end of the year.
Dan, this question is for you. You mentioned the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta group. In the research, we saw a dip in security concerns in the south as a consequence during 2008-9 approximately. Does the Gallup World Poll data do any measurement of perceptions around that movement as it relates to the extractive oil industry and corruption within government?
You know, I'm not certain if we asked any topical questions on that at the time. We're certainly, it's not something we're tracking now, though it's something we should probably consider, especially given the group has made some recent announcements about possibly resuming attacks. I believe their spokesman said he wanted to take oil production to zero by the end of 2015. That's perhaps not a bold claim. They did reduce oil production by 28% during the time when their attacks were active. We haven't focused on that specifically to the best of my knowledge, though, but I think what you see with the corruption items, again, that may be a factor at play with some of the views of foreign powers, as obviously a lot of these multinational oil companies are going to be linked in locals' minds to the nations in which they are based. But it's an interesting question that we should really dig into a little more.
Faith, right here. Lisa?
Good morning. Lisa Carroll, SRA International. I just wanted to pull the kind of the word of mouth and corruption string a little bit more, in particular word of mouth. In the interviewing process, did you see any linkage between maybe this decline in word of mouth and the corruption raising? Because in some ways people get afraid to talk about stuff, right? Any data
unfortunately,
there?
they come from two different surveys. So the corruption index comes from the World Poll versus the word of mouth question is from the BBG media survey. But in general, that people would be hesitant to admit that they listen to word of mouth is definitely not something I have observed. Granted, I have only seen interviews in the South. But frankly, what we've seen in other countries, if there's anything that people don't like to admit to, usually when it's an insecure environment, they don't like to admit to listening to certain stations, using certain things. But I've never seen anyone being hesitant to say, oh yes, I use word of mouth as a factor.
If I can just add on to that, I think another thing that we see in Nigeria is you actually have, although media freedom may not be where we'd like it to be, there is a very vibrant public culture of criticism of the government. I don't think this isn't sort of like some of the countries in the Gulf where people are afraid to voice those opinions in the same way. I mean, you see 90% say that they think the government is widely corrupt. Press in the country is sort of one of the reasons I think that domestic press may not have the same sort of, they may not have some of the confidence in the domestic press is because the biases are so blatant in a lot of the domestic outlets. Different parties are attacking each other publicly, and I think Nigerians on the street, whatever rate they're sharing news with word of mouth, I'm pretty confident that they'd be expressing their opinions openly. In the north, in the northeast, in the areas where Boko Haram's most active, there may be other topics that they're less willing to discuss, but in the issues of the government, I think they're pretty willing to share.
For anyone who works on development globally, you understand how important good governance is to the people around the world. Corruption, concerns about corruption, interest in programming related to corruption routinely figures very high in almost all of our surveys. It is, in fact, a global content vertical for those in the media business in terms of addressing problems that are endemic to a number of societies, and yet also register high on levels of interest of the population, learning more about that subject and what people can practically do to address corruption.
Okay, any more questions?
Chris, before we go, if I could just make one little brief announcement. I was just notified of the fact that a few moments ago in London, we just signed a major new affiliate partner in Nigeria, Channels TV. Concluded a deal. In fact, one of Governor Meehan's colleagues on the Board of Governors, Matt Armstrong, just signed for the BBG a deal for Voice of America English programming that will now be carried over Channels TV based out of Lagos, Nigeria. Channels is a nationwide network that reaches that media-rich component of the population in Nigeria. And so we're very pleased that we have concluded this deal. It is going to enable news and information to reach different parts of the audience in Nigeria that we certainly want to reach, and complements the great work that Leo is doing in his Hausa service and our colleagues in the Africa division of VOA. So I just wanted to note that. We're pleased that Channels is now in the BBG family of affiliates. We have more than 2,400 affiliate partners around the world on radio and TV. And this is going to be an exciting new deal in particular because it's going to be an interactive program that is based on an exchange every day, live and live to tape, between the Voice of America English service to Africa and Channels TV. So I just wanted to note that.
Thanks, Bruce. Just one quick reminder, June 3rd, Ukraine, will be a very interesting event, so we'll be getting those invites out soon. Again, the tape of today, the video of today will be posted on the BBG website along with the presentation, and we are adjourned. Thank you.